am live. Good morning. It is the 9th of January 25. I'm reading Vacation. It's a travel book by Joan Marshall Grant. Her and Charles travelled through France and part of Switzerland in 1946 to escape rationing in England, and they are now in Switzerland. I think they're about to leave. Chapter 25. Cultured Customs. An exasperated Charles, with his green hat pulled down over his eyes, was drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Fancy seeing you," he said sarcastically. "I thought you'd gone on a trip round the lake and parked me here indefinitely, but no doubt we shall reach Annecy by dusk if we hurry. The steamers aren't running, and if you're so keen on Annecy, why are we going to Grenoble? Are you sure all the luggage is in?" With a snort, he let in the clutch and swept through a flurry of cyclists. In silence we reached the customs, and while Charles went through the preliminaries, I thought wistfully of nylons I might have bought with a 50-franc note, which Patvert must have hidden in the car pocket for emergencies. However, as Charles had gone Irish on me, a last-moment bout of shopping would have been tactless. The two douanes were typical of the countries they represented. The Swiss checked everything, polite but thorough. Had we brought new tyres in Switzerland? Charles said genially that unfortunately it had never occurred to him. And smiling, they stooped and inspected each wheel to make certain he had not lied. Was there anything in the boot? Charles told them only the tools. They asked for it to be unlocked, peered inside, and made no comment when again he was proved innocent. They opened the bonnet and meticulously compared the engine numbers with those on the car papers, although the same men had done the same check 5 days earlier. When they turned to me and asked what I had bought, I told them even to 2 kilos of caramels. They asked me to open every suitcase, but allowed me to point out the items and did not investigate further. They finally said all was in order and there would be no export duty. They saluted and turned away. All had been carried out with the neat precision of a Swiss watch. While Charles took our papers into the French customs house, I talked to a delightful man whose uniform was as decorative as his moustache. I remarked that today it was unusually cold, but we had been fortunate in the weather during our few days in Geneva. "We've had excellent weather here too," he said, as though the countries were divided by at least 50 miles instead of 50 yards. "But today we suffer from the cold winds and damp which comes from the lake." It was clear the offending water was the Swiss portion of Lac Léman. We chatted on, and eventually, as though reluctant to introduce a sordid note into the conversation, he asked whether by any chance I had bought many silk stockings in Switzerland. I should have liked to bring dozens, but unhappily I have only 6 pairs. On this holiday it has been necessary to choose between buying things and drinking wine. Naturally, I chose the wine. Startled, he exclaimed, "But madame, the silk stockings would be still with you after the wine is drunk." "Ah, monsieur, but the memory of the wine will be with me long after the silk stockings would have been worn out." He almost embraced me, and we went into a spirited dialogue on the virtues of French wines, so incomparably superior to the products of Switzerland. "The Swiss keep their bayonets in the cask," I said. "Nothing less would account for the taste." This unjust remark was an immense success. It was obvious I must never waste my time by being in any country but France, where a woman of my sentiments would find proper appreciation. When Charles came back, my douanier, the customs official, advanced upon him, uttering the fulsome congratulations he considered due to a man so blessed by fate that he had a wife who preferred wine to stockings. Two lesser officials approached the car, but were waved imperiously away. They looked surprised, so my champion repeated the silk stockings virtue versus wine story for their benefit. Obviously, so cultured a woman must suffer no inconvenience. It would be an insult even to open the door of her car, a barbarity to ask to see the contents of a single suitcase. With handshakings all around, voluble regrets that our visit with them could not be prolonged, advice as to the better of the two hotels to patronize in Saint-Julien, we slowly drew away. Charles looked a bit dazed. I thought he was going to kiss me, he said in an awed voice. What on earth have you been doing? But he seems to think me fortunate. You are, I said, still glowing with the aftermath of unexpected praise. I know, he said, and I was immediately cheerful. The outside of the Cheval Blanc was much like any other small French hotel, but in the bar room it was too dark to read the notices on the wall. The wooden tables were set with bread and a single knife and plate at each place. One bread and beer, the thin beer which is now all the poorer because people can afford the thin beer which is now all that the poorer people can afford were being sold. About a dozen workmen delved into black oilcloth bags or paper parcels to extract small bits of sausage or meat, tomatoes or cheese, which they ate with the sour bread. A sorry lunch even by English standards, and misery for the French. The restaurant was more cheerful, and we started with cognac to keep out the cold. We had a dish of sliced tomatoes, 2 slices of salami and cold ham, a plate of fried potatoes, salad and cheese, and a carafe of vin ordinaire. The bill was 700 francs, of which 400 were for food. This was the type of restaurant where before the war one would have had a far better meal for less than a 20th of the price. For us, it meant about 30 shillings, but how much more did it mean to a workman who was probably earning 300 francs a day? In 1938, I dined in a hut patronized chiefly by lorry drivers. Chicken soup with chives, a mount of wild asparagus, half a chicken cooked in cream, brie, cheese, unlimited butter and white bread. With it, half a bottle of good local wine and coffee. The cost was 15 francs, at that time worth about 18 pence. We passed another Petrol octroi a few miles after Saint-Julien, and were relieved to think we were free of customs for a while. However honest one appears to be, there is always a sense of guilt when suitcases are opened. A rapid inventory flashes through the mind in the drowning man tradition, a forgotten pair of stockings lurking in the linen bag, or an ignored chemise seen about to leap from obscurity and demand humiliating explanations. So it was reasonable for Charles to swear when, at the beginning of a high bridge, we saw a plot of police standing in attitudes of expectancy. Had I been so chatty that my douanier had succumbed to unjust suspicions and telephoned ahead to have us stopped, where the process would be a deterrent to another tourist? Suddenly I remembered that we had forgotten Charles' obviously new wristwatch and my lighter, presents we had given to each other. How had we forgotten? For both of us had intended to declare them. Though true, the story would sound very thin. The police closed in, determined men with handy pistols. Their expressions suggested that the chance to let off a few loud bangs was what they had most desired. The head of the largest appeared through Charles' window and delivered 4 questions with stem gun continuity. Where had he come from? Where was he going? What was his profession? Was I his wife? Charles, with commendable calm, suggested that the best way to get information would be to look at our papers. He was told to produce them full battery. He was told to produce them, his papers, forthwith, in a tone intended to show us they were unlikely to be deceived by forged documents. I was about to scrabble under the coats to find the case in which they were kept, when we were saved by feet, who had been crunching sadly up and down during the interview with Head. I called them Feet and Head, for I never saw the whole of either. Feet said something to Head, which we did not hear, but the effect was startling. 1,000 apologies were due to us. By some incredible error, they had not mentioned the GB plate on the car. We were English, and therefore the honoured guests of their country. They were looking for a Mauvais type, who was also driving a black Citroën. With beaming smiles, the posse saluted. We drew slowly away, feeling like very minor royalty who had just declared the bridge open. I laughed. "I am one up on you. You were only a gangster and a pickup of mine who was so nervous that he had to fortify himself with port." "It was excellent port," he said contentedly. We were driving placidly along when Charles abruptly uttered a robust oath. Familiar though I am with his chameleon changes, I was a little startled. "What happened, darling?" "I left my hat at the lunch place, my green hat. That was at last getting decently decrepit. I suggested going back, for I too was fond of the hat, and what was another 40 miles among so many? This idea proved unacceptable, so I comforted him with the assurance that a letter to the Cheval Blanc would be enough to convey his treasure through the post where it would wait for us in Paris. He thought this ridiculous optimism, but in fact it suffered no harm from the journey and met him again within 10 days. Annecy, which now had no mana as a place where we wished to eat, made little impression on us, but Aix-les-Bains, the miasma of departed dowagers rumbling over the pavé to the palatial baths, lay heavy on the spirit. I shuddered and would have hurried on, but Charles drove slowly through the dead streets, revelling in the funeral atmosphere which matched the gloom induced by his errant hat. Before I became used to Irish temperament, I should have been anxious, but by now I have learned that while lesser breeds must go to a sad film to enjoy vicarious misery, the Celt can get the same result at will, which he finds the perfect anodyne for boredom. Past close hotels and shuttered villas, we came to a main road and drove along it, until a signpost announced that it led back to Geneva. A left-hand turning eventually brought us to the lake, a drear expanse of grey water dotted with huddled fishermen in boats. By Chambéry, the sky was clear again, and we bought grapes to eat on the way. Just outside the town, the road forked, and both were signposted to Grenoble. We chose the one through Chagnin and followed the Isère as it hurried down the valley under a high encampment, watched from the east by mounting heights whose peaks were secret with mist. We had forgotten that Grenoble has both a garrison and a university, so we were momentarily surprised to see so many troops and so much exuberant youth in the street. We inspected several hotels from the outside and found that the first 3 had not been opened after de-requisitioning. Then, in a narrow alley, we saw what seemed a genuine patver. Instead of dingy paintwork and decaying stucco, there was a bright facade with brilliant blue shutters and lettering of excellent modern design. I waited in the car while Charles went to investigate. "A sugared pill," he said when he came back. "The only people I saw were a slug white boy and the patron, a man of monstrous fatness." I was conducted on a tour of the bedrooms. They are vast, coal dark, and smell as though they have moulded unseen for years. There is no bathroom, though there must be at least 50 rooms, and I doubt if there is even the most primitive plumbing. Hurriedly we left in case someone came out to persuade us to change our minds. We were both glad We were both glad to find a room with a bath at Le Trois Dauphins, which We were both glad to find a room with a bath at Le Trois Dauphins, which, though of the four-star variety, had a decor which lifts it out of the usual rut. I think the sitting room must be a period piece unique in Europe, the decade of 1905 at its most horrific decade. Every motive of that era of misguided taste is represented. Tormented vases on porcelain pedestals, murals in which owl and iris I think the sitting room must be a period piece unique in Europe, the decade of 1905 at its most horrific. Every motif of that era was misguided taste. It is represented. Tormented vases on porcelain pedestals, murals in which owls and iris, lily and bulrush writhe in a vortex of decoration. The windows should have had curtains of serge tapestry with bobble fringe, but there were no windows, and the sepulchral subfuse came through a skylight which had been painted in a linoleum-esque imitation of stained glass. Charles went to garage the car, and I began to unpack. There were only 4 suitcases. I asked the porter if there was still one left in the car. He assured me it was empty. Now I knew why the luggage had seemed less crowded on the way back. We had left a suitcase in Geneva. Falling so soon after the hat incident, this was tough on Charles. He would be sure to blame himself and refuse to admit the fault was equally mine. Action must be swift before he could make unnecessarily complicated plans. I seized the phone and appealed to the girl at the switchboard to get me through to the Beau Rivage without delay. How she performed this astonishing feat I cannot imagine, unless Patver, who no doubt realized he had been disgracefully idle, immobilized his friends to take charge of the connections. Not only did I get through, but I had a clear line and the receptionist was available. Perhaps he had suffered before from absent-minded visitors, for he seemed undismayed and said the fault was not ours but the porter's, who had failed to bring the suitcase downstairs with the rest. Apparently, it would be difficult to clear it through the customs, though it contained only clothes for the laundry and all our spare shoes. I told him I wanted it sent C.O., a friend at the British Embassy, and he said this would solve the difficulties. I asked if I should send French or English money to pay for it. He said that neither was permitted and there would be no charge. It arrived unlocked and unravished just before we left France, and judging by the stamps on it, the carriage must have cost over £5. The door opened and Charles came in, looking like a small boy whose puppy has torn the inside of a cherished sofa. "It's all right, darling," he said. It couldn't matter less, and it's gone to Paris. And a kind waiter has brought brandy to revive us. And there's ice and Perrier too, if you want them. He hugged me. The next chapter is entitled Grande Chartreuse. Have a lovely Thursday.